My guest today is Professor Stephanie Schmitt-Grohé, who's Professor of Economics at Columbia University and an associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and a research affiliate at the Center for Economic Policy Research. Her research focuses on the design of monetary and fiscal policies, including optimal macroprudential policy, and on understanding the sources and propagation of macroeconomic shocks within and across countries. Welcome, Stephanie.
No, it's great to be here again. We talked in 2021, I think, so it's
Yeah,
nice
yeah.
to
At the
catch
height
up
of
again.
COVID. At the height of COVID, yeah.
Yeah.
And 4 years later, nothing seems to have changed. Uh, that's the nature of time, I guess. So I have a few of your papers, and I want to go through them. So the first one is exchange controls as a fiscal instrument. You say here about 20% of countries employ multiple exchange rates. An important rationale for this practice is the creation of fiscal revenue. This paper develops a general equilibrium model with exchange controls. It shows that such controls can mobilize significant fiscal resources, but also cause currency shortages, misallocation, and smuggling. The paper studies an optimal taxation problem where chronic fiscal deficits must be financed with money creation and exchange controls. Yeah, so I don't have I'm not an economist, Stephanie, and the little economics I studied 35 years ago was mostly of the micro variety. And so I'm very interested in this. Just an anecdotal example. I don't know if you would consider this to be exchange control. So when I was growing up in South India, I had to come to the US in the mid 80s, and my dad gave me some dollars. It was for $50. My dad gave me $50, and part of it might have been domestic capital constraint, but part of it could have been, if I remember correctly, there was some sort of control by Indian government not converting Indian rupees into dollars in the mid 80s, if I remember correctly. $50 would have been quite difficult to go from O'Hare to Evanston. In the 80s, I would have extinguished most of my reserves in dollars, but luckily I had somebody pick me up. And so what do you mean by exchange controls?
Yeah, it's really funny that you mentioned this particular example, um, because when we give this paper, there's very often somebody in the audience who says, look, when I came as a graduate student from India, maybe around that time, and I arrived in New York and I had to make it from New York to Penn to Carnegie Mellon, say there
Yeah.
was an acute dollar shortage in India. Even if I had a lot of rupees, the central bank wouldn't allow me to exchange it. So you are thinking about exactly the right thing. So usually, I mean, most people probably living in advanced economies think, okay, this is the exchange rate. I'm going to go to England. Currently, this is the exchange rate with the British pound. I, as an individual, can exchange as much as I like at that exchange rate. Or if you're a company and you want to import something from England and you have to make payments, suppose you had to make payments in British pounds, there's a market exchange rate and you know you can use it and there's not a problem. So that
Mhm.
is a world without exchange controls. What is a world with exchange controls? That is something that typically exists in emerging countries, so India would be a
Yeah.
case, or also poor countries,
Yeah.
that often comes together. Mm, And the setup is, in a stylized way, most of the time the same. So the setup is like this. We have an official exchange rate, let's say 1 peso for $1.
Hmm.
However, at that exchange rate, you cannot freely transact. In particular, suppose you live in Argentina and it were 1 peso, $1. Well, at the time they put it, it was more like 1,000 peso per dollar recently. Um, you cannot at that exchange rate purchase dollars. And if
Hmm.
you, but there's a very active black market, which is called the blue,
Hmm.
in which you can buy dollars at a premium. So that is usually called the parallel market premium or the dual exchange rate premium. So how big are these premium? in the example that motivated us to write this paper was what happened in Argentina in the last 10 years. And so there was one episode of exchange controls where the premium was 60%. So basically you had to pay in the black market 60% more than in the official exchange rate. And then it went, by 2023, it went up to almost 100%. So
That's good business.
that's good business. Well, and so why, if the official exchange rate, so you're rationed out, I already explained that. And when you read in the newspaper about that, you usually hear terms like there's a dollar shortage, meaning at the official exchange rate you can't buy, and at the black market exchange rate you don't have the money to buy. It's not truly a dollar shortage because often there are ways around the official exchange rate. And on the other side of the coin, let me mention other countries that have that. Bangladesh has it, Burundi has it, Russia had it now with the sanctions.
Yeah.
Argentina had big ones. Nigeria, Ethiopia. As you correctly cited the introduction, about 20% of countries in the world right now have at some point these exchange controls.
So anybody who doesn't have a free floating currency exchange is practicing this, right?
No, because you could say, okay, so I'm going to answer your question in 1 second. I want to explain another very important thing about what it means to have an exchange control. Suppose you're in Argentina and you're an exporter of soybeans.
Yeah.
And you sell to China in the international market, and suppose you are being paid in US dollars. At that moment, you cannot take the dollars into your country. You have to give the dollars to the central bank, and the central bank gives you the official exchange rate, say 1,000 pesos per dollar, whereas the black market is 1,500 pesos per dollar. So it is like an indirect tax on exports. So you have to give of your export earnings, you have to give, in this case, 500. You have to give up 500 pesos basically. So
And
you have a
that's
50%.
that's a private entity that's imposing the premium, right?
Well, okay, so the official one is the central bank. And then there is like this black market, which is not so black because you can do large transactions, and you can also use in part the banking system for that market. And so that is a market determined exchange rate. But it's complicated. So it's on both sides. This, when there are exchange controls, is on, if you're an exporter, is as if you had an export tariff because you are getting a very bad exchange rate. And if you want to import, or like you want to go to Northwestern and study, you just cannot get your hands on dollars at the official exchange rate. So you're rationed out, and maybe you didn't want to go to the black market, or you were too small. You were just a PhD student and you couldn't organize it. And you maybe didn't also want to pay an exchange rate premium of 80%. So that is finishing with your first question, what is the definition of exchange controls? Your second question was, are there always exchange controls in place when a country does not have a freely floating exchange rate? And my answer here would be no. Imagine you are a country who pegs the exchange rate to, say, to the euro, right? So whenever, and suppose you want to have parity with the euro, and so whenever the exchange rate moves away from parity, the central bank intervenes. That is called a fixed exchange rate regime, but at whatever peg they have, you can freely exchange money, right? You can exchange money at that rate. So it is not a feature about whether you have a floating exchange rate or a fixed exchange rate, but it is a feature about being able to do quote unquote unlimited transactions at that exchange rate.
So let me understand this, Stephanie. So suppose I peg my currency and I stand ready to defend, so to speak, an exchange rate for a long period of time. I'm finding it hard to understand why that is any different from an exchange rate, exchange control. In practice, that is like an exchange control, isn't it?
Okay, so suppose let's go to back in the
Yeah.
90s when we were not on the euro yet. Austria had always a peg to the German mark way
Mm.
back then. But suppose you were, let's make the example now. Suppose you're a hospital mm, in Austria and you wanted to import an MRI machine, right?
Yeah.
So, and to buy an MRI machine, you need hard currency, and suppose it was German marks.
Mm.
Even though the Central Bank of Austria was pegging the exchange rate from the shilling to the German mark, you
Mm.
could, if you needed, I don't know, 3 million marks to buy the MRI machine, you could do it. It was
Mm.
just that the exchange rate was pegged. Now, think about a hospital in Buenos Aires in 2022.
Mm.
They want to buy, they went to import an MRI machine for their hospital. So they would have to go, there's a two-step procedure that would be in place. You first have to apply to the import tariff office and say, I have this need, I have a lot of patients, I need to have an MRI
Mm.
machine.
Okay.
Do you give me the right to import? Suppose you
Yeah.
get that. Suppose you have that little piece of paper in hand, I'm allowed to import. Then you have to run over to the central bank and say, okay, I know the official exchange rate is 1,000 pesos per dollar. I want to import this MRI machine from the US. Are you going to give me the right to buy the US dollars at the
Okay.
official exchange rate of 1,000?
Yeah.
And they're going to say, no, sorry, I just gave it to somebody else who's a very good friend of mine who's building something in the south made of pipes. So
So
you
there's a
might not be able to do
constraint.
it.
There's sort of an aggregate constraint that they have to manage in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah, so
So,
what you read
yeah.
in the newspaper in those cases is, for example, you can try to smuggle the machine in, right? You can
Mm.
try to bribe, first of all, the guy in the port a lot and say, look, give me the import permit, and then you make up somehow the payment for the machine, and
Mm.
that forces you into smuggling, right? So
Yeah.
that's, or you say, I cannot buy it. And
Mm.
then you say to your patients, I'm really sorry, but right now we would like to know how your cancer is doing. We would like to check these pieces, but we don't have the machine. And so
Mm.
what happens typically in these regimes of exchange control is the newspaper reporting is of this type is we have a tremendous dollar shortage.
Mhm.
And because of that, we have a tremendous shortage of intermediate inputs and the economy begins to shrink. Suppose you are, let's go back to
Mm.
Argentina. Suppose you grow soybean.
Yeah.
And one of the things you use is John Deere harvesters. Have you ever seen one of those big
Yeah.
harvester
Yeah. Yeah.
machines?
Yeah.
They
Totally.
are
Yeah.
like not like a little car, they are big.
Yeah.
And suppose a piece breaks and you need to buy that, I don't know, one part of the harvester you need to buy from the US to fix it.
Mm.
You go to the import agency and look, I need the import permit, and you go to the central bank and say, are you going to give me dollars at the official exchange rate?
Mm.
And they're going to say, you know what? Right now we are really short of dollars.
Mm.
And then the field goes unharvested because the harvester isn't working. They don't know how to domestically produce enough harvesters. And so you get, because of a lack of
Mm.
the ability to import intermediate inputs in production, you see a big decline in output.
Mm. So, am I thinking about this correctly, Stephanie? So, pegging is sort of a strategic policy to say in the long run, we want to peg our currency to a dollar at X to Y,
Mm-hmm.
and it reduces all the uncertainty. I mean, you can do business at X to
Mm-hmm.
Y without any constraints.
Mm-hmm.
The 20% of the countries that you mentioned here is sort of an arbitrary exchange rate control mechanism that has some not well specified aggregate constraints. You have to deal with the regulators and all that stuff. That's very different from somebody saying, hey, my currency is $1 to $2, and you can do whatever you want with it. Um, that reduces all the uncertainty around transaction, right? So, but the larger question is, why do they do that? I mean, is there some sort of strategy that says, "Hey, I believe it's 1 to 2, and at some point I'll get to 1 to 2," or what is causing that?
Oh, okay, so this is now this outside of what we do, but in general,
Yeah.
I think let me reformulate your question. So some countries conduct monetary policy by playing around with the federal funds rate. Other
Yeah.
countries use as the instrument not their domestic interest rate, but they use as the instrument the exchange rate. And the example you give is a peg. So why would any country do that, right? So you could conceptually think about a currency union as a form of a peg. You know, when Spain decided
Hmm.
to join the European Union, it gave
Yeah.
up. It's basically it's pegging to Germany. I know they have the same currency, but conceptually it's the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why do countries do it? So one issue is when can they do it, but why do they do it? This is a very, I would say, good or rapid way to stop inflation. Suppose you were a hyperinflationary country.
Oh,
You
okay.
solved your fiscal problem that was the root cause of the inflation,
Yeah.
and you want to stop inflation immediately. You could peg to the US dollar and you
Hmm.
inherit immediately sort of not immediately, but you know that you're
Hmm.
going to be very close to the US inflation.
Assuming
So
US inflation is very small.
yeah, or well, then go and peg to the Swiss. I mean, the Swiss,
Yes.
I think, are back to
Yeah.
below 1% inflation.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that is so a peg is maybe very good if it is feasible. You know, it cannot be that you need money creation to finance your fiscal deficit, but it can be a
Right.
very useful instrument to control inflation very fast.
Hmm. So going back to Brazil and Argentina, Latin America in general, where we have seen hyperinflation, when those countries have gone into inflation problems, did they peg their currencies to control that?
Well, I mean, there are basically two big cases. If
Yeah.
if you have a major fiscal problem, right? Meaning that that the government is spending more than it is collecting in revenue, then monetary policy can generate some income through the inflation tax, right? And
Yeah.
if you ask me about pegs in Argentina in 1991, Argentina had just gone through a very high inflation, and they brought
Hmm.
in a new president called Menem, and they got rid of the old currency and they introduced a new peso, and it was very simple. It was 1 peso to $1. And this peg lasted from April 1991 to December 2001. And
Hmm.
why in the end were they unable to defend the peg? They ran into a recession in 1998, right? The Russian crisis
Hmm.
and so on. And they had a fiscal deficit. And once you have a fiscal deficit that is so big that you need money creation, that you need the inflation tax, you can no
Hmm.
longer have it both ways, that you have a big inflation and a big inflation tax, but you keep the exchange rate to the dollar, say, pegged. And then there was this spectacular collapse in December
Hmm.
2001.
So this is a little bit outside the topic, but I just want to get your perspective on this. So there's sort of a credibility issue. So
Mm-hmm.
suppose a country peg it 1 to 2
Mm-hmm.
and keep changing the peg, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
or just go to something dramatic, 1 to 5, in a single
Mm-hmm.
step function change. Um, is there a difference between the two?
Well, one thing is, are they going to 1 to 5 have a massive devaluation because they have no other choice because they have a fiscal problem? Suppose we
Yeah.
go, there are two branches of the tree. Suppose monetary policy is really independent. They can do what they want. They are not handcuffed by the necessity to generate fiscal revenue. Suppose we are in that good branch of the tree.
Yeah.
Then there's a lot of literature on why a peg is a good way to reduce inflation very fast and to bring inflation down. It is also a very bad monetary policy to stabilize the business cycle. So that
Hmm.
was, illustrated very clearly when the financial crisis came in 2008. And so all the southern or the peripheral European countries, let's say Cyprus, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Latvia, Lithuania, and so on, they all didn't have their own currency anymore. So it was like they were pegging to the euro or they were on the
Mm,
euro. And if you want to change normal prices very fast, it is
mm.
very efficient to quickly devalue your exchange rate and you change
Yeah.
relative prices.
They
And
lost their
that
monetary policy fundamentally when you joined the EU. Yeah.
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
that was a moment where people said, okay, these guys can no longer do monetary stabilization policy for their own country.
Mm,
Usually in a crisis like this, when unemployment in in Spain shot up, unemployment in the entire periphery shot up, the usual adjustment of the monetary authority would have been a devaluation to change
mm.
relative prices in the country, but not because they had a fiscal problem. And then
So,
with the
sorry. Yeah. Go ahead.
no, go ahead, ask.
No, no, I was just going to ask you, so how does the EU think about this? I mean, you should know a lot about this. So it is a sort of an accumulation of different economics, different inflation. It's a patchwork of countries that seem to be very different. So from an EU perspective, how do they have, I mean, so I signed up. I'm Greece. I signed up to the EU and I lose my monetary ability. But how does the EU do that? I mean, do they think about this? How do they think about this? Yeah,
Yeah. So, first of all, if you think about what principles they had at the beginning,
yeah,
you might always think when they were into a monetary union, why did they have this master criterion which said that debt to GDP, government debt to GDP had an upper limit of 60%, and then also the fiscal deficit as a fraction of GDP had a cap, right? That they couldn't have such a big fiscal deficit. I
yeah,
think that was basically to make sure that fiscal policy in each of these countries was consistent with having
mm,
continuously a low inflation rate. That's sort of more a
mm,
long run thing. Then you're asking me about another thing. They gave up their monetary independence. So if they went into a massive recession, like in 2008, they
yeah.
couldn't devalue as they could before, right?
But could they have an independent recession in the EU system?
Well,
Could Greece have an independent recession?
okay, so one thing is, did they all get a recession at the same point, or do they sometimes get idiosyncratic business cycle shocks? But
Yeah,
if we
yeah.
go to the
That's
big,
what I'm asking. Yeah, yeah,
so if we go to the big crisis of 2008,
yeah.
it was that everybody was suffering a lot because it was actually not something that was going wrong only in Portugal, the 2008 financial crisis, and then from Portugal it spread to the rest of the world. No, no, no. It
Right.
was actually probably it didn't originate. That financial problem didn't originate in Europe.
It was
But what,
systemic to the whole thing. Yeah.
yeah, I would say it originated maybe in the United States. But what did it mean for the periphery? They had been borrowing like crazy from abroad. And
Mm,
at that moment, they couldn't borrow from abroad anymore that much, not because something fundamentally changed in their country. It was the
mm,
opposite of the case you think of. You ask me about an idiosyncratic shock to Portugal. I'm going
yeah.
first to the opposite side. I'm saying, suppose there's a global shock, global financial crisis of 2008, and all these countries that had been borrowing, they had a lot of capital inflows in the periphery, they suddenly couldn't borrow anymore.
Mm,
So demand in these countries fell. When demand falls, there has to be an adjustment in relative prices.
yeah.
You know, they have tons of non-tradable goods that nobody wants to eat because everybody wants to eat much less because as demand is lower. So how can they still sell all these non-tradable goods for which they have capacity? Must be
Mm,
that non-tradable goods become much cheaper. Usually that adjustment is very easy.
yeah.
The head of the central bank announces instead of 1 peso per euro or 1 peseta per euro, now it's 5 peseta per euro. So
Mm,
they do a big devaluation. They couldn't do it, and that
yeah.
is why they had such a big recession.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that is why there was a lot of pressure, on the system. And just
mm,
before I answer your question about idiosyncratic shock, is also in general, since the EU was created, people, I think, understood very well that from a purely economic standpoint of giving up monetary control to
mm,
manage the short run dynamics of your economy is never going to be welfare preferred
mm,
to having, to being on the euro. So you had to, so usually the argument is the benefits of joining a currency union must be coming from somewhere else other
mm.
than from the monetary policy choices it gives you. So now I'm going to answer your question.
Yeah,
Suppose you're sitting in the council of the ECB and you learn that only Portugal has a tremendous shock and is going into a big recession. That was
right.
your question. So what is
That
the
was my
ECB
question. Yeah,
doing?
yeah,
Is an idiosyncratic shock to Portugal. What will the ECB do? Well,
yeah,
the ECB has to sort of, it's not going to be the case that the ECB will ease massively just to help
yeah,
Europe, or sorry, just to help Portugal, and then
yeah,
maybe risk deviating a lot from their inflation target, right? So there is this type of conflict. How much should the European Central Bank's policy
mm,
respond to purely idiosyncratic shocks?
mm,
And since they cannot do it fully or as much as maybe if there was an independent central bank of Portugal would do it, there are other mechanisms to bring the Portuguese economy back to full employment. They insist on more labor mobility, on more capital mobility, so that
mm.
hopefully the recession that is idiosyncratic to that country is not so deep.
Yeah, so a local shock could be dampened by scale
Mm-hmm.
in some ways. At least that's the
Mm-hmm.
hope. I love the euro. I can go to Portugal, Spain, France, and don't be worried about the currency. So you say here in the abstract, under plausible calibrations, the optimal policy favors multiple exchange rates, stronger controls on exports than on imports. Both exchange controls and inflation finance significant portions of the deficit. So I'm assuming that you're talking about the US here more specifically, right?
Are you back to the paper on exchange controls?
The same, yeah, on the exchange
Yeah.
rates.
Okay.
Yeah,
So let's go back now to exchange
yeah,
control. So
yeah,
we have established that exchange controls is a very different monetary policy regime than an exchange rate peg, because
yeah,
there is no free convertibility
yeah,
of exchange. It is a quantity control system. So
right.
then you might ask yourself, this sounds, also the examples that I gave you might make you think that looks like a really bad system. So for example, you are very good friends with the central bank, and these very scarce dollars you can buy at the official rate very cheap. You
Mm,
can make a tremendous buck. Suppose you get it from the central bank for 1,000 pesos per dollar, and you can then sell it in the black market for 1,500. You
right.
can, there's a big incentive to cheat. So there's a lot of misallocation and corruption that comes with
Mm,
that. And so
mm,
there are two economic terms people use for that is over invoicing. Suppose you got the right to import and therefore you got the right to buy the exchange rate at the official rate, which is super cheap. You just over invoice, you lie a little bit. My pipes cost
yeah.
me 17 million if in
Hmm.
reality they cost you $2 million. And with the difference, with the $15 million, you do the arbitrage in the black market and you,
You get a 50% profit. Yeah,
yes, exactly. So there's tons
yeah.
of smuggling. Also so that's something what makes it, so I want to build the case why it's very bad and why they nevertheless, we think, do it. So
Mm,
now think about exporting. I told you already, if you're exporting,
yeah.
then you will have to get the official exchange rate, which is a really, really bad deal.
Hmm.
So you under invoice with exporting. So that
Mm,
suppose you are selling, I don't know, meat to China. Argentina exports meat to China. The way that goes is that you say, I'm exporting meat for $1 million. In
mm,
reality, maybe it's worth 2 million. It's sold to Cyprus. Then in Cyprus, it's just put on a ship with a different flag, and it's somebody you're in cahoots with, and that guy sells it at the true world market price to China, and then they have to somehow smuggle the dollars back in using the
Yeah.
black market to avoid the haircut they get on the official exchange rate. So first of all, it leads to smuggling, to fraud, to completely misallocation in the economy. You cannot use intermediate inputs for production. The local economy has to work much harder. Basically, the domestic factors of production have to work much harder. Labor goes up and is very inefficient. So then you ask yourself, but why? Why do they do it, right? And typically, that is the story we tell in that paper, is these are countries who have a major fiscal problem. They have already maxed out on the labor income tax. They have maxed out on the official tariff. They are unable for political reasons to cut expenditures. Often the government is very bad. And so they have a fiscal deficit they need to finance. So now you might think, okay, you can see how the government makes money of this, because when you export, they give you the bad exchange rate, and then the government itself can go to the black market and exchange it for the good exchange rate. So exchange controls generate fiscal revenues. Of course, on the import side, it's a subsidy, but they completely limit. It's like a quota. The number of dollars you can buy at the official exchange rate is, for all practical purposes, really small. So exchange controls is another way beyond tariffs and regular taxes for a government to make money. But then comes the question, well, common sense answer to that would be, if I were running a country and I'm trying to pick one more way to generate some government revenue, why do I at all go with subsidizing imports by giving some people a little bit of foreign exchange at the official rate? So one of the things that the paper says, if you just solve an economic problem, what's the most efficient way to use this horrible instrument to generate revenue would be that you never ever sell a single dollar at the subsidized rate, right? It just makes no sense. The government makes money on the export side, but why should it subsidize imports?
I know that you're
And
working
we
on a
give
new paper, Stephanie. Sorry to interrupt. I know that you're working on a new paper. Do tariffs is tariffs sort of I mean, I haven't seen the paper, but is tariffs sort of a complementary mechanism here, or it's
Right.
different?
You could say, why aren't they doing plain vanilla tariffs? And we
Yeah,
argue that they have already reached tariffs that are so high. But just to finish with what that paper points out,
yeah,
many of these countries insist on that story, that they have a single exchange rate and you can do both sides of the market. You can buy dollars at the exchange rate and you can sell dollars.
right.
So we are arguing a little bit that it might be tied to the insistence of the IMF that to be able to be a program country, you are not allowed to have multiple currency practices, which is another word for exchange control. So that's one of the things we argue in that paper. And then the second thing we ask, why can we understand that countries use exchange controls instead of just using printing money and generating the hole or filling the hole in the fiscal budget with money creation and high inflation? And we say that if they insist on this unitary exchange rate, meaning that they also have to sell a little bit of the cheap dollar for imports, then it is better from an optimal taxation point of view to fill the hole on the fiscal side with money creation. So these are the 2 points the story of the paper is trying to sell.
Yeah, so let me go to another paper, Stephanie. So heterogeneous downward nominal wage rigidity,
Mm-hmm.
foundations of a nonlinear Phillips curve. So you say here we propose a model with heterogeneous downward nominal wage rigidity for individual labor varieties arising from cross-sectional dispersion in nominal fairness standards and labor productivity. The model delivers a nonlinear wage Phillips curve, linking current wage inflation with current unemployment that is relatively steep at high levels of inflation and relatively flat at low levels of inflation. As I mentioned, Stephanie, um, I haven't really looked into macroeconomics for 35 years, but my sort of fading memory from 35 years ago is that I think of the Phillips curve sort of um, concave. Um, that is not the
Convex,
case.
right? Like, yeah. So,
Convex, yeah.
yeah.
That's not the case. I mean, we
No,
thought it is
okay.
linear. Yeah.
No, no. So, well, I think maybe one of your professors was Mr. Phillips Curve himself, but um, but okay. So to give some context, so the Phillips curve is the idea that suppose you have on the horizontal axis unemployment,
Yeah.
on the vertical axis you have a measure of inflation. So in what we do in particular is we have the wage inflation. And then you're right, it looks like the left half of a U, something that if
Right. Right.
unemployment is very low, then wage inflation is very high, and if unemployment is very high, then this thing flattens out. So
Flattens
that
out. Yeah.
is that we know since a purely empirical paper by Phillips in 1958, where he had British data from somewhere in the, I think since 1856, and just made a plot of wage inflation
Mm,
against unemployment. And it looked like that. Okay.
mm. Yeah.
And he already said, why do I think this looks like this? This was pure data, what he did, very
Yeah.
simple data. He said, I
Yeah.
just think that the root cause of such a relationship is downward normal wage rigidity. Was his
Mm,
conjecture, but
yeah.
that was it. Mm, And then and then Phillips curve went through many iterations, but I
Yes.
would
Yeah.
say that the Phillips curve really became the dominant paradigm to think about monetary policy with the work of Mike Woodford and people like him in the mid 1990s. But just for what people were doing there, they
Mm,
have a certain model. That model is rather complex. And to characterize it, they linearized that model. So it's not the type of model people used was
mm,
linear, but the way people analyzed these models was linear. They just
mm. Okay.
linearized it and thought there was a linear Phillips curve, meaning a linear trade-off between um, inflation and unemployment, and maybe there were some variables that shift that Phillips curve, so that is fine. And I think
Mm,
looking at the economy through that lens worked very well during this period, which was called the Great Moderation, 1984 to
yeah.
maybe 2008, because the US economy was extremely stable. There was very little volatility in real output. Inflation was very stable. So having a linear approximation to something was fine because
Mm,
fluctuations were small. And
yeah.
then we got in 2008 one big shock, the financial crisis. And there the question was then, I think by October 2009, unemployment was almost 10% in the US.
Mm,
And then people were saying, okay, if we want to get back to a more normal rate of unemployment will have to come back maybe 3, 4, 5 percentage points.
yeah.
And if we are thinking about our normal trade-off between inflation and unemployment, having a reduction in unemployment by 5 percentage points should come with massive inflation, right? That was
Yeah.
sort of the concern. So we will go back to normal, and we don't think it's a shift of the Phillips curve, it's a movement along a given Phillips curve. So the expectation was, given the estimates people had, that that would lead to a lot of inflation. And then there was no inflation. We all know what happened after 2008. Um, for
Yeah.
10 years, the Fed struggled to ever reach the 2% inflation target. Inflation was super low, right? And then people were thinking,
Yeah.
maybe this way of analyzing the trade-off when we have big shocks is not great. We need something nonlinear.
Right.
And the
Right.
same thing came up now in COVID. Post-COVID, there was a lot of inflation and unemployment was very low. And people were saying, oh, if we bring the inflation rate back from 8 to 2, we are going
Mm,
to pay a very high price. Unemployment is going to become very large. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that the inflation stabilization was very cheap in the sense that it didn't cause a lot of unemployment. Unemployment was
Mm,
very low, 3.8%, maybe 4.1, 4.2. But the the fighting of the or the bringing down of the post-COVID inflation didn't cause any
mm,
any sizable increase in unemployment. So that triggered many
yeah.
economists to think about what causes this non-linearity in the Phillips curve.
Mm. So, so I don't understand this, Stephanie. So I'm just trying to understand. So most of what we talk about is sort of monetary intervention.
Hmm.
There is also fiscal intervention.
Hmm.
Suppose I have a helicopter, I print money, and I shower it on people
Hmm.
for a few months. That should also create inflation, right?
Right. Or if you take a lot of money out of the system, you can also bring the price level down. Yes. But the issue is, what is the underlying mechanism in the economy? So
Yeah,
between a monetary policy and a real outcome. So that particular relationship has a nominal variable on the vertical axis, which is inflation,
yeah.
and it has a real variable, unemployment or the output gap on the horizontal axis.
Mm,
So you must have some model in your mind why there's at all a relationship. Suppose you think monetary policy doesn't matter, and that is because all prices are fully flexible. That kind of relationship doesn't exist, and there's
yeah,
absolutely no relationship. That would be a vertical Phillips curve. There's absolutely no
right.
relationship between anything monetary and nominal and real output.
Mm,
So what do monetary economists do to get any relationship between nominal variables and real variables to matter? They need to make an assumption.
yeah.
And the key assumption they all make is that in the short run, not in the long run, in the short run, prices cannot really adjust very well. There's something wrong with prices. There's like maybe it's informational frictions or
Or
but
wage rigidity is part of it.
yes, or wage rigidity, but then you could say, okay, wage rigidity, why is there wage rigidity? How come normal wages cannot fall easily? So
Mm,
mechanically, what is usually in all of these type of models in which monetary policy has real effects is a very simple ad hoc assumption that some prices or wages cannot adjust in the short run to the desired level. So much of
mm,
my work with Martin has been on downward normal wage rigidity.
yeah,
Always the problem that your normal wage in some sense is too high to ensure full employment. Your wage should fall. It can't because
yeah.
we just assume it can't. And then the real wage is too high to bring full employment. And so in that particular
Mm,
paper, we show how from this simple assumption, you can get a story of the left side of the U, this convex Phillips curve. And so we
mm,
the basic idea is that in such a model, there's so-called Keynesian unemployment, which has to do with
mhm,
monetary factors, because some people have too high of a wage rate. They have a nominal lower bound. They make, I don't know, $18 an hour.
yeah,
Given how economic conditions are, that a firm wants to hire that worker at $18 an hour, he's just too expensive, but he would be happy to hire everybody in that profession, so or in that line occupation for $15 an hour. But for some
right.
reason, social norms are that we can't cut the wage, right? So suppose now you go, how could you solve that model as a central bank? Well, if you generate a little bit of inflation, then the real wage of that guy who has an $18 normal wage falls, and you
Mm,
might be happy to hire him.
mm, mm,
Okay. So in a world where you have downward normal wage rigidity, it's always true that if you have some people unemployed because of Keynesian, like
yeah.
monetary problems, is always that their normal wage is too high in real terms to be fully employed. So it's always
Mm,
true that if you inflate the economy, you choose the real value, you lower the real value of that wage, and
mm,
employment goes up. So now
mm,
suppose you have a lot of, for reasons I'll explain in a moment, you have very different degrees of downward normal wage rigidity in society.
yeah,
And suppose you have very high unemployment.
yeah.
Then what will happen? Well, if many people are unemployed for Keynesian reason, it's almost mechanical. Many people will benefit if there's more inflation because their real wage falls. So many
Right.
people will work more. So the trade-off between you just need a little bit of inflation to reduce unemployment by a lot.
But does a employer really see real wages?
No, the employer
Nominal
sees
wages.
the normal wage, but he also
Yeah.
sees the price at which he can sell, and he can see at the price he posts what is the demand. He can say, oh, maybe I can cut my price, but the problem is if I cut my price, I can sell more, but I cannot cut my costs because I cannot cut the wages of the people who work. So even
Hmm.
though maybe I have complete autonomy in setting my price, suppose I assume just for the argument's sake, that
Hmm.
prices are fully flexible. I bake my bread. I can set the price of my bread as much as I want, high, down. I see
Hmm.
demand is low. Nobody comes to my shop. I'm going to lower my price. But if the people I employ, for some reason, the normal wage I pay them, I cannot lower because then
Yeah.
they maybe start shirking or something, then it is as if prices are sticky and the market cannot clear. There's too little demand to
Yeah.
buy all the breads.
So the gig economy should help here, right? So the gig economy introduces flexibility into the system. Um, you're not going to work for GM, GE, and IBM for 30 years, where the CEO says, I can fire these guys, but I cannot reduce their wages," which seems sort of an irrational thought process. But in the gig economy, that's not a problem. I mean, this is a
That is,
marketplace.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I have not seen a study
yeah,
whether, there are studies about whether how sticky normal wages are and how easy it is to cut normal wages, right? And is it true that if you can change jobs easily, then maybe wages become more flexible? And oh, since you started with India, I'm going to give you there's a
yes.
very nice paper by an Indian economist in, I don't know if she's Indian descendant, Suprit Kaur at Berkeley. She made this very nice study. So sometimes people say, you told me, the gig economy. In Europe, people will say, it's true that if you work for the official sector, you can't cut the wage. But in Europe, we have also a very nice informal sector.
Hmm.
So, for example, the plumber comes to your house and the plumber says, okay, I can fix the sink officially with a receipt. This is the price. Or I can also fix
Yes.
the sink and we just pay cash, right?
No taxes. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. And they
yeah,
say, and so the usual argument is that is called the informal sector, that in the informal sector,
yeah,
wages are really flexible. I can cut the wage of everybody as much as I want. And so maybe there is stickiness in the formal sector, but in the informal sector, there's real
yeah,
wage flexibility. So Supreet went to India
yeah.
and looked at the daily agricultural labor market since the 1950s. And so she described it there's like a little pub in the city
Hmm.
where workers stand this in the morning, and then the landowner comes and says, I need you, you, and you to come today. And the
Yes.
Indian government has been conducting a survey
Yeah.
of what is the normal wage of daily agricultural laborers
Hmm.
since the 50s. And Suprit has that data. So then she says, okay, I know how much demand there is for workers because I know how much it rained in that district. So I
Hmm.
know I have a very good instrument for a negative demand shock. Suppose
Hmm.
I know in a certain district it didn't rain. I
Yeah.
already know the landowner 4 months later will not need that many workers, right?
Hmm. Okay.
And so she looks at whether in the districts where there was very little rainfall, the nominal wage fell, and she finds
Yeah.
no declines in normal wages, but a lot of people being unemployed. Then she also
Wow.
shows, so
Yeah.
what is that? That is a proof that even she claims these as the most informal of informal
Hmm.
labor markets,
Hmm.
there is something that prevents the normal wage from adjusting to clear the market.
Hmm.
She also shows that if you were unlucky and had low rainfall in your district, and it happened to be a year in
Yeah.
which in all of India inflation was high, there was no involuntary unemployment, still no wage cut. but there didn't need to be a wage cut because the real wage fell because there was inflation in all of India, and there was no rationing of workers, and there was full employment in the village.
It's sort of psychological, is a conclusion that you can make. But then if the wage provider, I don't know what the right term is, and the
Mm-hmm.
wage taker, if the
Mm-hmm.
wage provider has too much power,
Mm-hmm.
she's going to decide what the wage is. Um, and I wonder if it is sort of a monopsony problem
Oh,
that
oh, okay.
ultimately leads
Very good
to,
question.
yeah,
Very good question. So just to say, in all the work I do with my team on downward normal wage rigidity is always is competition. Nobody has market power, and
yeah,
it's just non-Valrasian market clearing. But there is a line of research who says, okay, you convinced me empirically. It seems to be that wages are very difficult to cut because people feel hurt and they get angry and then they shirk and they don't work well.
hmm,
But suppose, let's go with your idea of monopsony power. Suppose, and that's a very hot topic in the US, some people argue that firms now have a lot of monopsony power in setting wages. So then people who are interested in downward wage rigidity together with monopsony power said, well, if I know I'm a monopsonist and I know I have a problem cutting the wage in the future,
hmm,
I'm just not going to give them in good times such a big wage increase because I know then I will be stuck with this high normal wage.
yeah,
And so they claim that if you have downward normal wage rigidity and monopsony power, it doesn't look that different than if you had two-sided wage
hmm,
stickiness that you couldn't adjust very well. But you know
hmm,
what is a very good example why I
hmm,
think that's not true, but that's my opinion.
yeah,
Let's go to Europe. In Europe, there was
yeah,
a massive boom before they went into the financial crisis of 2008. When they
yeah.
adopted the euro in 2008, 2000, for 8 years or 7 years, there was a boom between 2000 and 2007. The
High
boom,
mobility, high everything. Yeah,
yeah, very rapid capital inflows.
yeah.
Wages in the periphery of Europe increased in those 7 years, is a long period, about 80%,
Oh,
nominal
wow.
hourly
Okay.
wages, right? About 80%.
Hmm,
So at the time, people were saying, so first of all, that is for me just prima facie evidence that people say, no, 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 I'm not going to increase the wage because later I cannot lower it. If the wage goes up by 80%, that's a word, And this
hmm.
happened for maybe your listeners. Inflation was very low between 2000 and 2007 in the European Union. So it was
So,
not a compensation for inflation.
yeah,
Then
yeah.
people were saying, oh, you know what? Productivity growth must be really
Hmm.
great. There's all this capital flowing in the periphery, and they are just becoming really productive. And it's
Hmm.
not a normal wage increase per se, but it's a compensation for more productivity. And
Yeah,
then
I
we
mean,
all know
a
there
constraint
was
was
no
removed.
productivity growth. None. There was
Yeah,
none.
yeah. So it's also like opening up the dam. You know,
Mm-hmm.
water rushes out. A constraint
Yes.
was removed from the
Mm-hmm.
employers and the
Mm-hmm.
employees, for that matter, and it settles to a new equilibrium.
Mm-hmm.
So the equilibrium that witnessed pre-euro was a constrained equilibrium. So
Mm-hmm.
just removing the constraint was an 80% increase in wages. Um, so just imagine if we made the whole world a single currency thing, we could see a lot of improvements in productivity.
I think it was not, there was no productivity improvement. So the official
Yeah.
measurements, in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, were trying to understand why so much money was flowing into the periphery and why was it driving up wages so much. And they just concluded that it was a lifting so there was no TFP growth. TFP numbers in
Yeah. Yeah.
Ireland were negative. TFP numbers for that period, 2000 to 2007, in Spain were very low or negative. So it was just a lifting of capital controls. And so there were very big capital inflows. So if you can suddenly borrow easily from abroad, domestic demand goes up.
Mm.
and people produce things that they can import, consume things they can import, and they consume things that are locally made.
Yeah.
And in the short run, everything that is locally made, namely housing, all non-traded goods, have to become more expensive because demand is so strong. So it's a
Mm.
very typical thing that you see in economics. If they have huge capital inflows, maybe because
Yeah.
you removed capital controls, that the country becomes expensive.
So
And
it's
when the country
demand
becomes,
driven, fundamentally
it's
demand
purely
driven.
demand driven. It's
Yeah.
a demand shock.
So I want to finish up with another paper, Stephanie. So what do long data tell us about permanent component of inflation? So you say here is post-war data enough to estimate the permanent component of inflation, and we want to define that. We find that it's not for episodes of sudden and large inflation spikes, like the one observed after COVID-19 pandemic, because such episodes are rare in the pre-war sample. I think you mean post-war sample here. Maybe I
Oh,
didn't
I have a
understand.
typo. I don't. No, no. The whole
Yeah,
paper is about. No, the whole
yeah.
paper is about that if you start, which is common because the data is nicer and better in the 50s,
Yeah,
there
yeah.
was
I think you
they
mean the post-war sample. The inflation of the 1980s took 15 years to develop. Our
uh-huh.
pre-war data is rich in sudden inflation spikes that's provided useful information. So I found this really interesting, Stephanie. So you say can estimates using data over the period of 1900 to 2022 predict that the permanent component of inflation increased only by 1.3% of
Mm-hmm.
points from 2019 to 2022, but 5% points when estimated using 1955 to 2022 data. So, yeah, so the horizons matter. And how we understand data depends on what data we are using. And that's a big difference, 1.3 to 5%. So before we get the details of this, Stephanie, so what do you mean by permanent component of inflation? How do you compute that?
Okay, one way to think about it, but it would be to say maybe in modern language would be an inflation target.
Yeah,
So a central bank is, but an inflation target might not really be the permanent component because they might always talk about the target but never reach it. So
yeah.
that's why we don't use that word. For example, Japan has talked forever about
Mhm.
a target of 2%, but have never reached it. But
Yeah,
there is something that determines the permanent component of inflation. Sometimes it's fiscal policy, what is driving it, but it's really if you are trying to do a decomposition into transitory components of inflation and permanent components, that's sort of the trend component also. Yeah, so that's an inflation target and inflation trend.
so the permanent component you are defining as the Fed's target, which or other monetary authorities like 2% is a typical target. So that is what you're assuming as a permanent.
No, no. I
Um,
mean, it's an
no.
econometric procedure where you're
Okay.
saying I have current inflation
Yeah.
and I have something that is latent, that is unobservable, which is
Okay.
its permanent component. And
Yeah.
then you use an econometric technique to figure out from actually observed inflation, output, and other variables what that permanent component is. So
Okay.
if you want to say you can say you can say the transitory component of inflation is actual inflation minus its permanent component. So it's a
Right.
trend cycle decomposition. And so Martin had developed a certain method to do that in his first Neo-Fisher paper, and
Yeah.
here we apply that. And so the story here is that, well, if you look at the post-war history or 19 in that paper we do 1955 to 2022,
Yeah.
sort of the inflation story of the US was very simple. From 1955 until 1980,
Hmm.
inflation slowly but surely went up.
Yeah.
Then Volcker had the conquest of the inflation, and then after that came the great moderation. So the only time the US economy saw a big inflation spike
Hmm.
was in the 70s and that stayed for 8-9 years. So they thought it was
Mm,
a very persistent or permanent component. So then they see this
mm.
sudden inflation spike in 22, and the data has no other way than saying, yeah, I mean, given that in the last 50 years we have never seen that, or 60 years, it must be like
Yeah.
we are back to the 70s.
So it's a bit like if you did machine learning on
Mm-hmm.
data from 1955 to 2022,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't have any samples, any analogous samples
Mm-hmm.
to the shock, the COVID shock.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're saying here, if I understand this correctly, Stephanie, if you go to 1900,
Mm-hmm.
2022, there have been lot of shocks that put inflation pretty high up in many cases, right? So that could be a good machine learning sample. And
Well,
so yeah, yeah. Go
yeah,
ahead, sorry.
well, an econometric technique is
Yeah.
in some sense a machine learning example, right? Maybe it's a simple algorithm, that is used, but it is, after all, an algorithm through which to look at the data. And you're totally right. Before 1955, we had the big inflation that started a year or so before the Spanish flu in 1915. Inflation went to 15%. Then we had a big
Mm,
deflation of 10%. And then again in the 40s, we had very high inflation in the US. So there were a number of very rapid ups and downs. And
mm.
so if you train your data on that sample, I think your analogy is very good. Your data tells you, well, if you include the pre-post-war period, we are used to sometimes seeing spikes and they come back down. And so then when this algorithm tries to ask, okay, how to interpret the 2022 spike, it said, if I'm allowed to learn from since 1900, there's only 1.3%
Mm.
is persistent.
So can we,
And
so
we were
suppose we
lucky. We were right. We were very lucky. We were right.
yeah, suppose we remove the Spanish flu episode
Yeah.
from the 1900 to 2022
Hmm.
data, and we remove the COVID-19 episode. Will we find something different? I mean, what I'm thinking is, I don't know anything about this, Stephanie. I'm just sort of speculating here. Um, when there's a systemic shock, in this case, both of them are biological shocks that affects the entire world. We actually have very few economic shocks. I mean, I don't know. I would argue that is that prevalent systemically across the world. So biological shocks spread much faster, I would think. I don't know. So suppose we remove those two incidences, will we find something different?
Okay, so do you think that if I had trained the data on a sample that
Yeah,
started, say, in 1922
yeah,
and that ended before COVID,
yeah,
and then I ask that model to forecast,
exactly.
then
Yeah,
I show it the 2022 COVID inflation spike, and I ask it, whether
yes,
I still okay. So I did not play around with that exact. We cut the data a couple of different ways. We did also since 1943.
yeah,
We didn't do exactly what you ask us to do, so I cannot tell you whether the big inflation variations we saw in the 1940s would have been enough to tell the
yeah.
algorithm basically, wait a second, this kind of big increase that you saw with COVID need not be permanent. That's your question. No, I did not
Need
take
not be
out.
permanent. Need not be
But
permanent. Okay.
obviously, if I take
Yeah,
out any experiences of sudden going up and sudden coming down,
yeah.
the algorithm has no way. So if I go with yours, I would have to taken out the three big inflation spikes that happened in the 40s, which were all short-lived.
So yeah, yeah. So I was just thinking it is a biological shock different from,
Actually, the big
yeah,
inflation in the US
yeah.
in started before the Spanish flu started. Started 1 year before.
Mm,
Had other reasons. And here, the big inflation in the US in 1920 in 2022, I agree with you, came from COVID and was probably was a supply chain
Yeah,
shock.
yeah,
So
yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's also hysteresis effects here too. So suppose God help us, another COVID-like event in 2030. Um, we now know a lot more supply chain, brittleness in the system. So maybe we can tackle that better. Maybe. What do you think? I mean, what I'm saying is that the shocks would sort of abate as we get more information. Do you think that's possible?
well, I'm okay. So by the way, it's 5:37 and I
Yeah,
have
yeah. I have to let
somebody
you go.
else in
Yeah,
3 minutes.
yeah,
But this is what the point of our paper was to say. We have a lot of time series evidence now for
yeah.
long periods of time. And it's a little bit like the also is a common thread with the nonlinear Phillips curve paper. Maybe always thinking that the world is always in the great moderation in this really sweet spot we were from 1984
Hmm.
to 2007. Maybe, you know,
Not
sometimes it
typical. Not typical.
what
Yeah,
is typical? What is the
yeah,
normal? The
yeah,
great
yeah.
moderation or the wild swings of history?
I mean, yeah. I know that you have to go. So 1990 to 2007, internet. I mean, we made some great leaps into technology. Everybody was doing well. Um, Everything was going up, and then we hit some air pockets. It's the air pockets that actually help us learn about things, right? If everything is going up, yeah, I mean, it's not that interesting. That's sort of what you're arguing, right? So if you look at the whole time series data from 1900, we can see a lot of instances where things seem to be going good, and then sudden jumps in sudden discontinuities in the data that we can just assume happened between 1900 and 1955. Yeah. Excellent, Stephanie. Yeah, thanks so much for spending time
Thank
with me.
you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.